My brother borrowed $50,000 for his dream business, then ghosted our whole family. I tracked him down and confronted him. Now he's threatening legal action. It all started about 2 years ago. My younger brother, let's call him Jake, came to the family asking if he could borrow $50,000 to start his dream business. He had this grand idea for an online retail company that he was convinced would make millions. The whole family was pretty skeptical, as Jake had a history of getting these big ideas and then abandoning them halfway through, but our parents have always been suckers for their kids' ambitions. Jake was the youngest of 4 siblings, and growing up he had always been the black sheep of the family. While the rest of us were more studious and cautious, Jake was always the risk taker, constantly chasing get-rich-quick schemes and impulsively jumping from one harebrained idea to the next. Our parents, bless their hearts, had always enabled this behavior, constantly bailing him out and funding his latest venture in the hopes that this time would be different. I have to admit, I was probably the most cynical about Jake's business proposal. I'd seen him do this song and dance too many times before. Every few years, he would come to the family with some new entrepreneurial dream, swearing up and down that he'd finally found his calling. Without fail, the businesses would always fizzle out within a matter of months, leaving my parents out thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. But this time felt different to them. Jake was so passionate, so convinced that he had the secret formula for success. He went on and on about the market research he'd done, the business plan he'd created, the investors he was in talks with. Our parents were captivated. They really believed that this was Jake's big break. Against my better judgment, and the advice of the rest of the family, they decided to loan him the $50,000. They remortgaged their house to come up with the money, convinced that Jake was going to strike it big and be able to pay them back. I tried to talk them out of it, but they insisted that this time was different, that Jake was really serious about making this work. They said they could feel it in their bones, this was going to be the opportunity that turned his life around. I wanted so badly to believe them, to have the same sense of hope and optimism. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that we were all about to be let down, yet again. For the first few months, it seemed like the business was actually taking off. Jake was sending regular updates about orders, partnerships, and plans for expansion. Our parents were thrilled, constantly talking about how proud they were and how their investment was going to pay off big time. I, on the other hand, remained skeptical. I'd seen Jake's wild business schemes come and go before, and I just had this gut feeling that it was all going to come crashing down. Sure enough, about 6 months in, the updates from Jake started drying up. He would respond to messages and calls less and less frequently, until he eventually stopped responding altogether. Our parents started to get worried, but Jake would always have some excuse. He was just really busy with the business, his phone had been acting up, he'd been under a lot of stress. We all wanted to believe him, but the writing was on the wall. After about a year of radio silence from Jake, our parents finally accepted the fact that the money was gone and the business was a failure. They were absolutely devastated. Not only had they lost their life savings, but their own son had seemingly abandoned them after they had put so much trust and faith in him. I felt awful for them, but I couldn't help but feel a little bit I told you so as well. My parents begged me to try and track Jake down, to at least get some answers or an explanation. They wanted closure, and maybe even a chance to try and get some of the money back. As much as I didn't want to get involved, I couldn't stand to see my parents in so much pain. So I started digging. It took me a few months, but I was eventually able to locate Jake. He was living in a different state, about a 6-hour drive from where the rest of the family was. I considered just letting it go, but the thought of my parents suffering while Jake was living his life without a care in the world was too much for me to bear. So, one weekend, I got in my car and made the drive to confront him. When I showed up at his door, Jake was shocked to see me. He tried to play it off, acting like everything was fine and that he'd just been really busy. But I could see the guilt and fear in his eyes. I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. I laid into him, demanding to know what had happened to the money our parents had given him. At first, Jake tried to deny everything, claiming that the business just didn't work out and that he didn't owe anyone anything. But I could tell he was lying. I pressed him harder, reminding him of all the promises he'd made, the updates he'd sent, the trust our family had placed in him. Eventually, the facade crumbled and he broke down, admitting that he had never actually started a real business at all. Turns out, Jake had taken the $50,000 and used it to fuel his gambling addiction. He'd lost it all within a matter of months, betting on sports and playing high-stakes poker. When the money ran out, he panicked and cut off all contact with the family, hoping we would just forget about it and move on. I was absolutely livid. Not only had he betrayed our parents' trust, but he had the audacity to just disappear and leave them to pick up the pieces. I let him have it, unleashing years of pent-up frustration and resentment. I told him that he needed to pay back every penny, that our parents deserved to have their money and their lives back. At first, Jake seemed remorseful. He apologized profusely and even said he would try to get a loan or find a way to start repaying the money. But then his attitude quickly shifted. He got defensive, claiming that our parents had no right to demand the money back since they had willingly given it to him in the first place. He said that if I continued to harass him, he would take legal action. I couldn't believe it. After everything he had done, he still had the nerve to threaten us? I told him that he was welcome to try and sue, that we had more than enough evidence to prove that he had taken the money under false pretenses and then abandoned us. I said that if he didn't start figuring out a way to pay our parents back, I would make sure the whole world knew what a selfish, deceitful person he was. Jake just sneered at me and slammed the door in my face. I stood there, seething with rage and disbelief. How could someone do this to their own family? As I drove home, my mind raced with a million different thoughts and emotions. I kept replaying the confrontation over and over in my head, wishing I could have handled it better, wishing I could have gotten through to Jake somehow. But at the end of the day, he was the one who had betrayed us. He was the one who had taken advantage of our parents' kindness and then left them out to dry. When I got back and broke the news to my parents, their reactions were exactly what I had feared. My mom cried for hours, while my dad just sat in stunned silence. They had been through so much already, and now this. I felt so helpless, wishing there was something I could do to make it right. In the aftermath, the family dynamic became incredibly tense and strained. My parents were racked with guilt, constantly blaming themselves for trusting Jake and for putting the family in this position. They were embarrassed and ashamed, not wanting to face the rest of our extended family or our community. I, on the other hand, was just consumed by anger. I couldn't understand how Jake could do this to us, how he could so brazenly steal our parents' life savings and then threaten us when confronted. I wanted nothing more than to expose him, to make him pay for his selfish, irresponsible actions. But my parents, despite their pain, still loved him dearly. They insisted that we needed to give Jake another chance, that we needed to try and work things out as a family. They pleaded with me to let it go, to not escalate the situation any further. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, biting my tongue and not giving in to my desire for vengeance. In the end, we decided that the best course of action was to consult a lawyer and see if there was any legal recourse we could take against Jake. Our parents are now in their 70s, and losing that kind of money has put them in a very precarious financial situation. They deserve to live out their golden years in peace, not constantly worrying about how they're going to make ends meet. The lawyer we spoke to was sympathetic to our plight, but cautioned that it might be an uphill battle. Without any formal business agreement or contract in place, it would be difficult to prove that Jake had committed fraud or theft. He said we could potentially sue him for breach of trust or unjust enrichment, but the odds of recovering the full $50,000 were slim. Ultimately, the lawyer advised us to try and negotiate with Jake directly, to see if we could get him to at least agree to a repayment plan or settlement. The thought of having to deal with him again made my skin crawl, but I knew it was the best chance we had of getting any of that money back. So I swallowed my pride and reached out to Jake again, this time with a more conciliatory tone. I explained that our parents were in dire financial straits because of his actions, and that we were simply asking him to take responsibility and make amends in whatever way he could. I told him that we didn't want to have to take legal action, but that we would if we had to. At first, Jake was defiant and combative. He maintained that he didn't owe us anything, and that our parents were foolish for giving him the money in the first place. But after several back and forth conversations, I could tell that he was starting to feel the weight of guilt. He knew that what he had done was wrong, even if he didn't want to admit it. Eventually, after weeks of negotiation and compromise, we were able to reach a settlement agreement. Jake agreed to pay back $25,000 over the next 5 years, with a portion of that going directly to our parents to help cover their immediate expenses. It was far less than the full $50,000, but at least it was something. More importantly, it gave our parents a sense of closure and a glimmer of hope that they might be able to recover from this financial devastation. Even with the settlement in place, the damage to our family's relationships and trust has been irreparable. My parents are still deeply hurt and angry at Jake, and the rift between the two of them has only grown wider. As for me, I'll never be able to look at my brother the same way again. The betrayal runs too deep, the wounds too fresh. I know that my parents still love Jake and want to believe that he'll change, that he'll somehow make things right. But I'm not so optimistic. This wasn't the first time he's let us down, and I have a sinking feeling it won't be the last. The only thing I can do now is be there for my parents, to support them as they try to rebuild their lives and their finances. It's been a year since the confrontation with Jake, and the scars still haven't fully healed. I find myself constantly worrying about my parents' well-being, wondering if they'll ever be able to recover from this. And I can't help but feel a deep sense of resentment towards my brother, a resentment that I know will never truly go away. This whole ordeal has been a stark reminder that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and that family can be just as capable of betrayal as anyone else. I used to think that no matter what, you could always count on your siblings to have your back. But Jake has shattered that illusion, leaving me with a jaded and cynical view of the world. I know that I need to try and move on, to focus on the positive relationships and support systems in my life. But it's hard, especially when I see the devastating impact that Jake's actions have had on my parents. They didn't deserve this, and it kills me that they're the ones suffering the most. In the end, I guess the only solace I can take is that we were able to get something back from Jake, even if it's not nearly enough. And I'll keep fighting, keep advocating for my parents, for as long as it takes. They may have lost faith in their son, but they'll always have me in their corner. This is a chapter of my life that I'll never be able to fully close or forget. The damage that's been done runs too deep. But I'm determined to do whatever it takes to help my parents heal, to try and pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams. It won't be easy, but I owe it to them to try. It's been 2 years since I last updated this story, and the fallout from my brother Jake's betrayal has continued to reverberate through our family, causing even more pain and upheaval than I could have imagined. But through it all, my parents and I have persevered, determined to pick up the pieces and move forward as best we can. To summarize where we left off, after confronting Jake about the $50,000 he had taken from our parents, he initially expressed remorse and agreed to try and pay some of the money back. However, that contrition was short-lived. Jake quickly turned combative, claiming our parents had no right to demand the return of their own money. Devastated but not deterred, my parents and I decided to consult a lawyer. The news wasn't great. Without any formal agreement, it would be difficult to prove Jake had committed fraud. The lawyer advised us to try negotiating a settlement directly with Jake. After weeks of tense back and forth, we were finally able to reach a deal. Jake agreed to pay back $25,000 over 5 years, with a portion going directly to our parents. It was far less than the full $50,000, but at least it was something. More importantly, it gave my parents a sense of closure. Even with the settlement, the damage to our family's relationships and trust had been irreparable. My parents were still deeply hurt and angry at Jake, and the rift between them had only grown wider. As for me, I'll never be able to look at my brother the same way again. In the year following, my parents struggled mightily to get their finances back on track. They were forced to downsize their home, sell off investments, and cut back on expenses. It was heartbreaking to witness, knowing it was all a result of their misplaced trust in Jake. To make matters worse, Jake never ended up holding up his end of the settlement agreement. After a few payments, he stopped responding to my parents' calls and messages, effectively ghosting us yet again. I begged my parents to let me take Jake back to court, but they refused, still clinging to the hope he would eventually do the right thing. They couldn't bear the thought of more legal battles and disappointment. In the midst of this turmoil, my parents' health began to suffer. The stress and anxiety took a toll, exacerbating existing conditions and leading to a steady decline in their well-being. There were days my mom could barely get out of bed, racked with worry and despair. The COVID-19 pandemic only compounded their depression and feelings of hopelessness. I did my best to support them remotely, but I could see the light slowly fading from their eyes. It was then that I finally decided I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I made the difficult choice to take legal action against Jake, despite my parents' objections. The process was long, arduous, and emotionally draining, but we finally reached a settlement. It wasn't the full $25,000 Jake had agreed to, but it was a substantial amount to provide my parents with some financial relief. More importantly, the settlement included a formal acknowledgement of Jake's misconduct, an apology, and a promise to never contact us again. I wish I could say this brought closure, but the wounds are still too fresh. My parents, while grateful, are still deeply scarred. They've become distrustful, withdrawn, and wary of any future interactions with Jake or the rest of the family. As for Jake, I haven't heard from him since the final settlement was reached. He seems to have completely disappeared from our lives, which is a blessing. I know my parents would never be able to fully forgive him, and I wouldn't blame them. My parents have had to make difficult decisions about their future. They've realized they can no longer rely on the financial security they once had. With their retirement savings depleted, they've had to sell their beloved home and downsize to a smaller, more affordable place. It breaks my heart to see them leaving behind the home they built together. But I know it's a necessary step to provide them with a bit more stability and peace of mind in their golden years. My parents have also had to scale back on certain medical treatments and procedures, opting for more affordable, but potentially less effective, options. I worry constantly about the long-term impact on their health and quality of life. Through it all, I've tried to be there for them as much as I can. I've taken on more of the day-to-day tasks and errands, helping to manage their finances and household affairs. I've also made it a priority to spend as much quality time with them as possible, cherishing every moment. In a strange way, this whole ordeal has brought my parents and I closer together. We've had to lean on each other in ways we never have before, and I think it's strengthened the bond between us. But I also know the emotional scars will never truly heal. As for Jake, I've made the conscious decision to cut him out of my life entirely. I no longer have any desire to maintain a relationship with him, nor do I feel any obligation to try and mend the rift between us. He's made his choices, and he's going to have to live with the consequences. I realize this may sound harsh, but after everything he's put our family through, I simply can't bring myself to forgive him. The trust is gone, the hurt is too deep. I don't want him anywhere near my parents, or myself, ever again. Still, there's a part of me that wonders what ultimately became of Jake, where he is now, and how he's coping with the aftermath of his own selfish actions. A small, twisted part of me even hopes that he's suffering, that he's racked with guilt and regret over what he's done. But I know dwelling on those thoughts is ultimately unproductive. The best thing I can do now is to focus on the positive, on helping my parents rebuild their lives and find joy and comfort in the simpler things. We may have lost a significant chunk of their retirement savings, but we still have each other. And in the end, that's what truly matters. My parents have shown incredible resilience and strength of character throughout this ordeal. They could have easily become embittered, cynical, and distrustful of the world. But instead, they've chosen to hold on to hope, to find gratitude in the little things. They still talk about their dreams for the future, of traveling and spending more time with their grandchildren. And while those dreams may have been scaled back, they're determined to make the most of the time they have left. I admire their perseverance, their unwavering spirit in the face of such adversity. As for me, I'm doing my best to support them in whatever way I can. I've taken on more responsibility at work to help supplement their income, and I've started looking into additional ways we can bolster their financial security. It's an uphill battle, but I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to ensure they can live out the rest of their days in comfort and peace. I know the road ahead won't be easy, that there will be more challenges and setbacks along the way. But I refuse to give up. My parents deserve so much better than the hand they've been dealt, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let Jake's selfish actions ruin the rest of their lives.